Hey Samfam, and today we are going to discuss about SA 330, the auditor's response to assessed risk. First, will you see the objective of the auditor here? The objective of the auditor is to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence about the assessed risk of material misstatement. When he had assessed the risk of material misstatement in SA 315. This is so much of link to SA 315. Do watch that video if you haven't, and then continue this 330. It would be more relevant for you. So what the auditor has to do? Auditor has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence for the assessed risk of material misstatement. How he could respond, how he could obtain the audit evidence with regards to that material misstatement through designing, implementing appropriate responses to those risks. And see what is our golden rule. Whenever we've had any kind of deficiency, fraud, or irregularity in the entity, the auditor has to put some remedial actions, and before using that remedial actions, he has to respond to them and then follow up those remedial actions. And here are a few definitions with regards to that. Tests of controls. Tests of controls and audit procedure designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness of controls. Here, the auditor is testing or evaluating the operating effectiveness of the internal controls in the entity, whether they were preventing, detecting, and correcting material misstatements at assertion level. SA 320 or 330 deals mostly at an assertion level. Everything is in detail because they have risk of material misstatement. So everything has to be on assertion level to that specified or customized to that particular class of transactions only, and not at a financial statement level in general. Substantive procedure. What a substantive procedure? An audit procedure designed to detect material misstatement at assertion level. You see, it is mostly like an investigative part, right? Investigative or detective part where they are detecting at even assertion level. The substantive procedure comprises of tests of detail. Test of details were they were checking, the auditor is checking each and every minute detail, even with regards to the journal entries also. He's using mostly reperformance or recalculation in order to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. And substantive analytical procedure. As we know, analytical procedures were like comparison of financial and non-financial information like salary to employees, rent to square feet, etc. With that, the basics, we'll move on to SA 330 here. What the auditor should do in SA 330 have to design and perform further audit procedures. Why I had to do further audit procedures? Why not planned audit procedures? Even this was discussed in SA 315. I want to repeat it here now. You see, while planning the audit, he had planned some audit procedures, but during the course of the audit, he was finding some information which could result in some risk of material misstatement. So for that, in order to even audit such risk of material misstatements, he has to plan some further audit procedures in order to have more corroborative audit evidence and more sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. For that, since he is auditing the risk of material misstatement and that risk, this risk, other normal matters were with planned audit procedures, it would be sufficient. But since there were areas of risk of material misstatement, he has to perform further audit procedures whose nature, timing, extent are based on responsive to assess risk of material misstatement at assertion level. At make a note here, this is the key word, that assertion level. You have to write assertion level only. Why? Because financial statement is of a general level. Here you are going in detail, testing each and every point which has so much of risk that was involved in. So you have to go in detail. So that's why you are putting an assertion level here. Assertion is for that particular class of transaction or for that particular account balance or that particular disclosure. And what the auditor should consider the reasons for assessment given to the risk of material misstatement at assertion level for each class, transaction, account balance, and disclosure, including what he has to do. Whenever he found any fraud or any irregularity, what he has to find? He has to find the source, the parties involved, and the reasons for such irregularity or deviation or deficiency. He has to consider the reasons for such misstatements at assertion level. Like what? Likelihood of misstatement. Likelihood of misstatement is if the auditor had found so much of manual intervention in an audit, like he has to figure out like what percentage, like what likelihood, like 70% of likelihood that the material misstatement could happen with regards to that assertion level due to that internal control. So he has to find that likelihood of misstatement, whether the second thing is whether the risk assessment takes into account the relevant controls or not. He has to also take the internal controls, relevant internal controls also. Obtain more persuasive audit evidence. Persuasive is almost all audit evidence that higher the auditor's assessment of risk. As the auditor's assessment of risk is higher, he has to obtain more persuasive. That is, he has to increase the quantity. He has to obtain almost all audit evidence. Deviations from controls. There were some deviations from the controls. You see, controls were established by the management, but while doing operating the controls, there were few deviations with regards to that control. Why such deviations? What the auditor has to respond, how the auditor has to respond. The auditor shall make specific inquiries to understand these matters and their potential consequences. The auditor had done the first step to do. What's the first step initially? He has to inquire the management and evaluate the controls. And then what he has to do, he has to determine whether the tests of control that have been performed. Tests of control were performed by whom? They were performed by the auditor. Monitoring of controls were done by management. This was discussed in SA 315. That who put the controls, policies, and procedures, and who operates that, who tests the policies and controls. This was all discussed in 315. This deviation is occurred through whom? The one who is operating the controls. And this tests of controls were done by the auditor while he's testing the controls and have been performed, provide an appropriate basis for reliance on the controls. Have to test the tests of controls that have been performed, provide an appropriate basis for reliance on the controls. That he has to determine whether his tests of controls, that his audit procedures provide an appropriate basis for that reliance on that controls or not, and he has to do additional tests of controls. Like, since we have got some risks here, we have done further audit process, right? Here also you have to do additional tests of controls if necessary. If he found the degree of likelihood of misstatement was high, he has to do additional tests of controls also. And the potential risk of material misstatement need to be addressed using substantive procedures. What are substantive procedures for? Tests of details on substantive analytical procedure. You have to address those risk of material misstatement with regards to that assertions, like with regards to the journal entries that it had done or the ratios. He has to address those misstatements. And substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at assertion level. Then the auditor performs tests of control. If the auditor feels that the substantive procedures were not giving sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, which is the objective of the auditor under SA 330 here, to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence with regards to assess risk of material misstatement, then what he has to do, he has to perform tests of controls also. Because what he have to do, he has to, if there were any deviations in internal control, he will directly do tests of control. But when there were no such deviations there, what he has to do, he has to perform substantial procedures. What is that? Tests of details and substantive analytical procedures. If he cannot obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, then he has to move on to tests of controls also. When the approach to a significant risk consists only substantive procedures, those procedures shall include tests of details. That is, we also know that substantive procedures include tests of details. Auditor shall document. What do auditor shall document? What all he has done, he has to document. What he had done, he had done some further audit procedures and he responded to the assessed risk of material misstatement, and he had done some tests of controls, etc. He has to document only that. The overall response to address the risk of material misstatement at financial statement level and the nature of timing extent of further audit procedures and the linkage of the procedures, that the further audit procedures at assertion level and the result of audit procedures, including the conclusions where these were not otherwise clear. That is, conclusions were clear. And these are all the things he has to document. And retesting of controls. Yes, retesting of controls will link it to the methods how he could obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence He could do reperformance or recalculation of what he could reperformance or recalculations of any kind of balances or any kind of calculations that were done by the management in financial statements. Now, he should also retest the controls. First, he has to do tests of controls. Where are those? He had to do tests of controls. But when the risk for that, when the deviation for that control was significant, he has to retest those controls. When to what controls he has to do retesting, that is, he has to do testing twice when there's a deficient control, when deficient monitoring of controls. Retesting is like at testing of controls at assertion level. First, what the auditor tests all controls at financial statement level. When there were any deviations or deficient control, he has to retest that control. Deficient monitoring of controls, we have discussed that in SA 315, that one who operates the controls and one who monitors the control were two different categories. So whenever there's a deficient in that categories, he has to retest the controls. Any significant manual intervention, he has to retest. Personnel changes that significantly affect the application of change. When there were manual intervention, significant manual intervention, and when the personnel changes also, he has to do retesting of controls. Changing circumstances that indicate need for changes in the control, that is, any kind of events or that had happened or circumstances that indicate change for that control. And deficient general IT controls. These are all the things, these are all the case scenarios. If these qualifies for any internal controls, he has to do retesting of such controls. The length of time between retesting such controls is also a matter of professional judgment, but is required to be at least once in every 3 years. Once in at least 3 years, he has to retest the controls of these things. And with that said, we have completed our essay 330.